work with women who are particularly vulnerable in different ways, right? Whether they're vulnerable within, because when you were sharing that many of some of the clients you see are also vulnerable because of their immigrant status compared to their husbands who are Singaporeans, or women who are vulnerable because they're domestic workers or they're sex workers. So, is there something you'd like to? Is there overlap in the work that you do? Is it something that you think we need to pay particular attention to?
I think because there's this common trend of, it seems that there's a perverse nature in humankind, unfortunately in mankind, to take advantage of those who are the weaker. And in here, it could be the weaker gender, the person who is more disenfranchised, more disempowered. There seems to be that nature in us, that perverse nature that's the one to take advantage of it. So I think we need to speak with one voice about why should that be? You know, if we do have a position of advantage or strength, can we not use that in a more positive and a more constructive manner? It's not an opportunity to exploit.
Right. Right. Could you share a little bit about the dynamic you see with the women, the situations of immigrant women, and what are the other levels you need to consider in a situation?
Well, if she's coming in as a foreign bride, one first thing that hits her is that it's a strange place, it's a new country. Sometimes it holds a lot of promise for maybe advancement for herself or for her children later on. But it's a new environment. She doesn't have her support system. She doesn't understand how things work. How is one supposed to get help? She's not aware of her rights as a person. And sometimes she's basically told of her lack of rights. If your husband does not sponsor you, you can be deported. You will be deported. If you have children from this Singaporean husband and they are born here, they are citizens automatically. And if you are deported, you would lose the children. So immediately there are a lot of positions where she's really in a marginalized position. If she were to seek for employment and if she's not able to carry a professional qualification, then she's not going to get jobs so easily.
Right.
And she's going to be very dependent on her husband for her daily sustenance. So it's a very, one-sided relationship that we see.
In terms of the power, right?
The power
and do you see, where their partners, men use that against them to, and that is one of the reasons for the violence? Because, for example, I've heard of situations where, the husbands might say, you have to, whether it's, you have to have sex with me, or you have to do this, or you have to do that, because if you don't listen to what I say, I can cancel the
Sure, sure. I mean, it's a very accessible tool or lever that they use. And sadly, with the fact that these women are very dependent on the husbands take a position where they have a sense of entitlement. Because I married you, because I took you out of a village, because I provide for you, I'm entitled to have you in whatever way I want.
And I think earlier when we were talking with Jonathan, when you shared how so much of the abuse you see, whether it's against wives, women by their partners, or whether it's against domestic workers, you said there's a sense of wanting to control the woman. Right? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I go back to the example of the fact that some husbands feel that they have that sense of entitlement because they have brought in this person, they've taken care, provided for, and when they see these individuals becoming stronger, maybe becoming friendly with the neighbors, learning how to speak the language, maybe being able to even get some form of part-time employment. Some of these men actually feel very afraid, very vulnerable. That at some point in time, these individuals might then be strong enough to say, why should I live under these circumstances? Who would want to live under these circumstances? And that's where some of these men go and exercise very harsh forms of control to prevent her movement, to prevent her sense of a sense of self that's been formed in her.
Right. Jonathan, do you have something to add to that?
yes, I think that sense of entitlement is something which we see a lot when it comes to abuses against domestic workers. And it's often motivated by class and gender, class superiority and gender superiority. So, because domestic workers are socialized to be subservient, so employers and agencies encourage them to say things like yes ma'am, no ma'am, and to always take instructions without asserting themselves. They're not allowed to have a point of view. They're not allowed to say no. So this disempowers them and makes it more difficult to resist physical, verbal, and sexual abuse when it happens. And many of them are also economically dependent on their employers. And when they come into Singapore to work, they usually have to pay the first 6 to 8 months of their salaries to an agent. So they are already indebted. So they're especially vulnerable during this period. And they also have their mobile phones taken from them. And they're not allowed to go out. They don't have days off. So they are in effect cut off from the outside world. So you can imagine how that makes them so extremely vulnerable to any kind of violence that could happen in the house.
So if we were to sort of shift the conversation slightly, but on a related note to, this question of male violence, right? And I think specifically, whether it's the violence that a client might perpetrate against a sex worker or a husband might perpetrate against his wife, is there this sense of, like people often think of violence and men's violence as an anger management issue, right? And what would you say to that? Is it an issue of anger and of what is it? Why does it happen?
I think sadly, when we think of the stereotypical man, not very expressive, not very communicative, not very even in touch with his own emotions, but about the only emotion that he's permitted to have, and if he has, we say, well, he's a guy, is the emotion of anger. So when a man feels ashamed, when he feels vulnerable, when he feels afraid, sadly sometimes it is surfaced as anger. And so then the man doesn't know how to express his feelings beyond that of being angry. But there's another dimension to man and anger. And that when men feel that they are angry, they feel that it has to be expressed only in one way, through aggression, through violent action. We get angry all the time. We get angry with our bosses, we get angry with sometimes a police officer. But we don't allow ourselves to express our anger in going out and hitting our boss. I mean, not many men that I think of will do that. So it seems like in some situations these men are able to manage this anger, but in other situations they seem to give it free rein. And that I think is really some of the messaging that goes in to say, so when you're angry, you lash out, and you can lash out with your wife because, that's within the family, that's okay. You love her, so, you can do that.
So that's more socially acceptable.
That's socially acceptable, and sometimes maybe even the media seems to kind of propagate that message that, the man gets angry, he hits his wife. That unfortunately is not the right messaging.
So what is it like to be a man advocating for, who cares about, and is trying to talk to people about violence that women face, like whether it's domestic worker abuse or sex worker abuse. So how do you see your role, and how is it different because you're a man?
I think I have, I see my role as being somebody with a unique perspective. And this is with reference to the Boys the Police campaign. All the girls there, and Vanessa, they'd all known about this cultural phenomenon, this cultural practice. Guys from secondary schools going down, and they'd all been, victims of this form of harassment. And
so this is, just to clarify, this is specifically secondary school boys going down to areas where transgender sex workers work to heckle
and they will heckle, harass, even beat them up sometimes, okay? So they all have experienced that. But I came from a school where I was actually part of that. So I was able to stand on the side of the perpetrator and give them that perspective. And I think that's partially why we were able to craft the Our Boys the Police campaign. It's because I, as a man, had been in the role of a perpetrator, and I knew what was going through their minds. So men really have this unique opportunity to be allies to women in ways that you could never imagine. You have that perspective. Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit more about the campaign and what is it trying to do?
So yeah, the campaign was really we wanted to kind of do two things. We wanted to firstly call out the practice because we all know it exists, but nobody's ever really spoken out about it. Nobody's ever condemned it and say, hey, this is really, really wrong. This is detrimental as hell, And the second thing we wanted to do was really try to understand what were the societal forces, what are the institutional forces that are allowing this thing to continue on for years and years and years. So one very interesting thing that I managed to pull off also, like I said, because of my position as a guy, is just call up guy friends who I knew had partaken in this and say, hey, a couple of years back I heard you went down to Changi to go and harass the sex workers. Can you tell me about it? And they just spoke, They were like, yeah, I went down, I scolded them, I hit them, oh, no problem, man, So they could speak really, really freely with me. One of them even going so far as to say, hey, I felt like I have a moral imperative to go down and hit them and teach them to be your own gender. So, you have that. I felt like I was gifted with that opportunity. Yeah.
And what are some of the, you said, gave you insights into why this happens, right?
Yes.
So what are some of the things you understood about why boys do this?
So we looked at two things to try to understand why any human being would want to do this to another human being. So we looked at academic sources, and they talked about schoolyard culture. They talked about things like masculinity, testosterone, and about hierarchies and things like that. The second thing we did also was to talk to the boys themselves to get insight. That was the thing that I found most interesting, because they were telling us things like, one of them said he felt he had a moral imperative too. Other people were a little bit more self-reflective. They had come out of the system, they graduated, and now they would be 20-something years old, and they look back and they said, yeah, actually, why did I do that? That was pretty wrong, that was not a good thing. And then there were others still who were saying, it's not a big thing. The sex workers probably know that it's part of the job. So you almost have this sort of, you on one hand have people who take a moral stance to bully and harass sex workers, and on the other hand you have people who kind of try to normalize it in a way. They try to say things like, the girls don't mind it, they know it's part of their job. Or, they try to bring in morals, ethics, whatever they can to try to normalize it, or they say, oh, everyone does it, so it's okay. Yeah, that's the scary bit. Yeah.
And the people who are more reflective, like what did they, from their point of view, what makes this happen? Like, what is it about? You refer to schoolyard culture. Like,
Yeah.
what is that?
So yeah, it was really interesting because you read it in an academic source talking about schoolyard culture, and then you literally have a live example with you talking about exactly what this professor in the US is talking about. So schoolyard culture is basically this thing where you have certain guys who embody characteristics that people consider cool or manly, and these people rise up the hierarchy of the schoolyard. And what you then see is a lot of other boys trying to emulate this person. So everybody then wants to kind of follow him and the things that he does. Now, the way this is reflected then in Singapore's schoolyard culture with respect to this phenomenon of bullying is that one guy, and this is what I found out from the guy interview, you have one guy in 2002 go down to Changi and he would harass a sex worker. In 2003, you have another guy come back and say, I hit a sex worker. In 2004, it'll be, I gang raped a sex worker. It gets higher and higher and higher because of this hierarchy. All the boys have been fed that there is a hierarchy, and you go up the hierarchy by embodying these traits. So it gets worse and worse and worse because the situation is never addressed. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting perspective on like how as a man you have a special role or perspective in engaging other men, right, to talk about violence against women. But do you have that experience working with male perpetrators? How does it?
I remember this guy looking at me very cynically and he said, so I suppose you don't get angry. And I think sometimes we need, when we as men talking to other men, say, of course we do get angry, but what do we do with our anger? And I think that sad association that anger means violence. You know, anger must result in violence. I can't find any other way of dealing with it. So part of our responsibility as men is really to talk to them about, yes, how do we realistically deal with situations of conflict, situations where we are upset, and yet not erupt in violence. Because, you know, it's very interesting with what Sean you said, that even these young boys wanted to see something good in themselves. I'm setting right society's values, you know, I'm doing something positive. And I think many of the men that I meet who have been convicted of very violent acts also see themselves as, I'm not a wife beater, I really care for my wife, I love my wife. And to some extent, I believe them. But somehow in their expression of their care and concern, they aren't able to translate that to something more positive. So in working with these men, one of the things I find that is important to do is to challenge the man. How can you show her you love her without being violent? How can you show her that you care for her and you can actually protect her? You say you want to protect her, but when you beat her up, does she feel protected? The answer is pretty obvious.